I am Elena, 36 years old. I never thought a seemingly peaceful family dinner would turn into the moment I trembled in fear, whispering 911 in the bathroom. That day was supposed to be just a small gathering to introduce a new guest. But beneath the wine and the glowing candles hid a power game I never imagined I would be dragged into. And I still couldn't believe my eyes when the little daughter I had cherished with every ounce of my being was pulled into the dark schemes and crimes behind it all. I still remember Mr. Caldwell's faint smile as he placed the brown envelope on the table. He whispered to Clara, "Everything is ready." That night, I realized that if I kept being weak, the one who would suffer the most was my own daughter. And before I tell you what truly made me rise to fight back, leave me a comment and hit like if you've ever had to stand up to protect the one you love. This house has always smelled of old rain. That's the first thing that washes over me every time I open the door. Not the gentle scent of old books, nor the earthy freshness after a summer shower, but a damp, lingering odor, as if it clung to every wall, every crack in the bricks, every buried memory. I grew up here. In this 3-story house with its long, dark hallways, I learned to be silent before I ever learned to speak. I learned to listen to the sound of my father's footsteps, the length of my mother's sighs, to know when it was time to vanish from a room. I learned to read between the pauses in their compliments, kind words always sugar-coated, but behind them lay control, invisible boundaries. This house never once embraced me. It only taught me how to hide everything. The roof tiles have darkened with age, the window frames creak whenever the wind slips through, and the hallway light flickers like an old pair of eyes refusing to close. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt the house had a soul of its own, a weary witness that knew too much, yet never spoke. Then came Uncle Paul's funeral. The only man in the family who had ever been truly gentle with me. When I was little, he used to lift me high into the air, spinning me until we both burst into laughter. He was the first to call me a gift instead of a duty. But now, he was gone. And his passing didn't just take away a loved one, it opened a void that forced Maya, my daughter, back here. They told each other Maya needed rest. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? A teenage girl who just lost her only anchor needed a place to stay. But I knew the truth. Maya returned to this house because she had no other choice. She walked in wearing an oversized wool sweater, her eyes timid, as if stepping into a place both familiar and foreign. I had hoped my parents, Maya's grandparents, would treat her kindly. I comforted myself with the thought that, though they had never been warm to me, at least they would love their granddaughter. But soon I realized the kindness in this house was only a thin blanket, spread to cover up cracks. It soothed outsiders' eyes but never masked the cold within. A week after the funeral, they decided to hold a family dinner. "So Maya can feel the warmth," my mother said, her voice soft but her gaze sharp. I knew these dinners well. Porcelain plates lined neatly, silverware gleaming, crystal glasses clinking whenever they were raised. Everything perfect except for the suffocating tension lurking beneath every smile. The long table was draped in white linen. The adults talked of distant things, stocks, real estate, extended relatives. Now and then they turned to Maya, their voices so sweet they were almost cloying. "Are you doing okay, Maya?" She nodded, but under the table, her hand gripped the hem of her shirt tight. I noticed every detail. The chipped porcelain mug still sat in its place, like an invisible mark reserved for Maya. The silver keychain hung by the basement door, jingling faintly with every draft. The hallway light kept flickering, like a warning that someone was lying. Small motifs, but haunting, as if the house itself was trying to whisper a secret. Amid the laughter and chatter, I saw Maya lower her head, her hands sliding quietly beneath the tablecloth. A folded piece of paper, its edges trembling between her fingers. She looked up, meeting my eyes. Just a second, but enough for me to understand, something was crying out for help. Maya silently pushed the paper toward me. I unfolded it, my heart pounding. Just 2 words, scribbled hastily, the handwriting slanted and shaky. "Call 911. The air around me froze. Silverware still clinked, laughter still rang, but everything turned into a staged performance. I could hear the rush of blood pounding in my ears. In this house, kindness was used like a blanket to muffle every groan. But Maya, with that trembling note, had ripped the blanket apart, dragging me into a reality I could no longer ignore. And in that very moment, I understood, this house didn't just know how to speak. It was screaming. I immediately left the dining table, excusing myself to the bathroom. My heart pounded wildly, while the family's fake smiles still hovered above that oval dining table. My steps turned toward the living room. I closed the door, lifted the phone. My voice trembled but stayed firm. I need help. Something's wrong with my daughter. Please come. I can't explain everything over the phone, but please, come quickly. The operator only managed to ask a few questions. I answered briefly, then hung up. 20 minutes. It was the longest span of my life. When I returned to the table, every pair of eyes was on me. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her voice soft but sharp enough to pierce. "Where were you for so long?" Victor tapped his spoon against a wine glass, the shrill sound as if to drag the atmosphere back to normal. Clara sneered. She probably just needed to breathe, not used to the pressure. Mr. Caldwell remained silent, his thin hand still resting on the brown envelope, his fingernails tapping in a steady rhythm, like a silent reminder, this will be over soon. But the wind outside the porch signaled something else. Then came the knock. Firm. Heavy. Like a blade slicing through the dinner. Police. Every head snapped toward the door. Maya froze, her spoon clattering onto the plate. Margaret shot up, a stiff smile blooming. "Oh, there must be some mistake. Officers, you don't need to bother. This is just a family dinner." 2 officers stepped in. 1 male, 1 female. They walked straight, leather shoes knocking evenly against the polished wood floor, their gait carving a line down the room. The female officer scanned each face, then lowered her voice. "We need to speak privately with Maya." The male officer turned to me. "Ma'am, please step out to the porch." The air cracked in an instant. Victor cleared his throat, stood, his voice deep but tightly controlled. "I'm the father. Everything is for her own good. Truth is, she's a bit sensitive, prone to imagination. There's no need to make this a big deal." He spread his arms, the gesture of a seasoned negotiator. Clara crossed her arms, leaning back into her chair. "If she wants to cry, she'll get over it. You don't want to waste your valuable time on petty things, do you?" Her tone was lazy, but her eyes slid toward me with blame. Margaret forced a thin smile, her eyes narrowing, like someone who knew how to smother flames with a single line. "We all love her. She just needs stability. If you want, we'll sign any statement right now." But the female officer didn't budge. Her slight nod was firmer than any words. "We need to talk to the girl. Alone." The room swayed. Clara shoved her chair back in annoyance. Victor tightened his grip on the glass, the liquid trembling inside. Margaret hurried forward, as if to block Maya's way, but the female officer raised her hand lightly to stop her. That simple move froze the entire room. Through the window, I saw Mr. Caldwell still seated, his fingers tapping steadily on the brown envelope. One beat. Then another. Each tap like a gavel striking in court. And I realized he was waiting for it all to end according to his script. On the porch, I clutched the railing until my nails turned white. The wind rushed through the old bougainvillea, the dry leaves scraping against each other with a rustle like the sound of a case file turning a page. If it were you, would you stand still, letting your child speak first before stepping in? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes a story you share could save someone, somewhere, right when they need it most. Inside, Maya sat with her shoulders hunched, her small hands clasped tight in her lap. Her eyes glistened but never left the female officer, as if she had found a fragile anchor. I caught a glimpse of her through the half-closed door, and my heart clenched. I once carried her in the hospital, heard her call me for the first time, watched her trembling clutch my hand on her first day of school. And now, she had to call on strangers for protection. Victor leaned in, his voice low and heavy. "It's all for her good." Margaret echoed, sharper, "Yes, we love her. You can leave now, we'll handle it." Clara flicked her hand, eager to seal it shut. "It's nothing, don't make a fuss." But this time, every word fell flat. No one picked them up. Because the silence of the police was the only answer. And I heard the old saying again, echoing in my head, silence is an answer too. Unfortunately, it often sides with the powerful. 7 minutes. Just 7 minutes on the porch, I heard chairs scraping, spoons clinking against plates, forced laughter. Each pause between those sounds weighed like dust piling thick in my lungs. Until it all shattered like glass crashing on stone, I knew the truth was about to surface, and nothing could stop it. The female officer asked softly, as if it were just another step in the procedure. But the moment she opened the dark wooden cabinet next to the oven, something not normal came to light. Among the stacks of old coupons, neatly stapled together, there was a clear plastic bag. Inside were white pills, no label, no instructions, not a single word to explain them. The kitchen, blazing under fluorescent light and spotless to the point of sterility, suddenly felt cold. I stood still, my mind stirring with questions no one dared to say out loud. If they were only supplements, why hide them behind coupon stacks? If they were just vitamins, why not keep them in a bottle like everyone else? The living room grew unnaturally quiet. No more clinking of spoons and wine glasses, no more Victor steering the conversation. Only a hollow stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. One of the officers held a flashlight, its narrow beam sweeping down the hallway. Instead of leading upstairs, where walls were covered in framed family photos, he turned downward toward a white-painted door tucked away at the base of the stairs. The basement door. And on that door, something impossible to miss, a metal latch, bolted on the outside. That detail alone was enough to speak for itself. What do people lock from the outside? What needs to be kept in? No one needed to explain, because its very existence was a silent confession. I felt my heartbeat pounding as the male officer gripped the latch and lifted it. The sound of metal clashing rang out like a hammer strike. The door cracked open. A current of cool air, thick with dampness, spilled out. It was dark inside, but the flashlight quickly carved through the shadows. And what appeared first was not the chaos of a typical storage basement. On the contrary, it was spotless. Too spotless. A folding bed pressed against the wall, arranged with the precision of a hospital room. The blanket folded into sharp squares, the pillow set neatly in its corner. On a low wooden table, a few items lay scattered, but strangely, each looked as if frozen mid-story. An open notebook, the last pages scrawled with crooked handwriting. A pair of small socks, folded together, waiting to be worn. And then, a wooden pendant carved in the shape of an owl. I knew it instantly. It was the birthday gift Uncle Paul had given Maya when she turned 8. She used to wear it all the time, even to sleep, until one day it vanished without explanation. Now it lay silently in the basement behind a door that only opened from the outside. I couldn't tell if I was trembling from the chill or from the fear taking form. I wanted to step inside, but my legs refused. And then my eyes landed on a Polaroid lying on the table. The photo had been cut in half, leaving only one wide-open eye, a mouth caught mid-laugh. That incompleteness made it more haunting than a whole picture. Who cut it? And where was the missing half? A sound outside startled me. Through the narrow doorway, I saw Mrs. Nora, the elderly neighbor who lived beside the Caldwells, standing behind the old wooden fence. Her frail figure clutched the slats, her eyes fixed on the house. "Last night I heard crying," she said, her voice shaky but firm. Then the music came on. Very loud. As if someone was trying to cover something up. Her words pinned the truth in place like a tack. No one in the living room dared to breathe. Bars weren't needed when there was a door that locked from the outside. The thought echoed in my head, as clear as if someone had just whispered it. And suddenly, even ordinary details frightened me. Because sometimes, they were the very cracks that gave away the whole disguise. I asked myself how many times in my life had I overlooked what was off, simply because it seemed too small, too easy to dismiss as normal? A lock in the wrong place, a drawer hidden too deep, a room unnaturally spotless. Sometimes, those were the alarm bells. Have you ever noticed a small detail everyone else ignored? And if you had, would you dare step closer to uncover the rest? Remember, the truth never reveals itself. It takes someone willing to look a little harder and ask the question no one else wants to. Outside, the wind whipped through the dry bougainvillea, the rustle of leaves sounding like pages of files being flipped in haste. I shivered. Because it felt certain, what was turning wasn't just memory, but secrets locked away too long. Clara cleared her throat in the living room, trying to scatter the tension. Could it be just a storage room? Who's blowing things out of proportion? Her tone feigned laziness, but her eyes never left the wooden pendant on the table. Victor stayed silent, his jaw clenched. Margaret quickly jumped in, a false smile spreading fast. "If necessary, we'll explain." There was nothing but good intentions for the girl. But their words now were as flimsy as scraps of paper, too weak to cover the truth. I looked into the basement, every detail speaking louder than any explanation: the hospital-like folding bed, the untouched socks, the unfinished notebook, the wooden pendant, the cut Polaroid. Together, they formed a silent indictment needing no judge, no witness. There was no blood, no chains. But it was precisely the unnatural cleanliness of the basement that screamed the sharpest accusation. And I knew then, the question was no longer what had happened. It was, who started it all? The officers had just come up from the basement, exchanging a glance, a tiny nod, but enough to chill the entire room. Margaret fumbled, clutching the edge of her sleeve, then quickly regained her composed facade. She turned toward the doorway, signaling for the man in the dark suit still waiting outside the porch to step in. "He's the lawyer," Margaret declared, as if the title alone were a certificate of morality. The man gave a slight nod and set a brown envelope down on the dining table. Caldwell said nothing, only pushed the envelope toward the officer, his fingernail tapping a slow rhythm on the wooden surface, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The female officer glanced at it, then slowly opened the envelope. Not medical records. Not a psychiatric evaluation. Inside was a draft of a care authorization, a waiver of inheritance, each box already pre-filled with Maya's name, leaving only a blank space for a signature. There were no words like rest or delusion anywhere. Each sheet lay cold and blunt, like a confession. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction but a plan drafted, timed, mapped out. I heard Margaret's voice, soft yet sharp. "We only want what's best for her. She's too sensitive, and someone sensitive can't manage on their own." Victor cut in, his tone deliberate. "Adults have a responsibility. We simply prepared so that, when the time came, it could be signed. For her own good." I noticed the female officer's lips pressed together, her gaze digging deeper. Mrs. Nora, still watching from behind the fence, kept her doubtful eyes fixed on the scene. Clara broke in, quick, as if afraid the police would read another line. "Just sign it, and everything will be fine." I looked into Margaret's eyes. And there, in their depths, I saw a reflection of myself at 13 sitting in a dark room, listening to my parents fight, then being told, "Be quiet so the house can stay peaceful." That shadow, they now wanted to cast on Maya. My fingers clenched the armrest until my knuckles went white. One sentence throbbed in my head. When adults say for the child's own good, they usually mean for their own. No one objected. Only the ticking pendulum clock on the wall, swinging back and forth, keeping time for the deceit filling the room. The male officer cleared his throat, his eyes passing over the envelope, then Margaret's face, Victor's, and finally stopping on Caldwell. Caldwell didn't speak, he simply lifted his teacup. The mug tapped softly against the saucer, an accidental sound that repeated itself, like a quiet signal. The female officer closed the envelope. She didn't sign. She didn't hand it back to Caldwell either. She simply set it down in front of her, her palm resting lightly on top, as if to say, "We see everything." Margaret's thin smile faltered, her confidence slipping. Clara turned away, biting her lip hard. Victor sat upright, but beneath the table his hand trembled slightly, tapping against his trouser leg. I drew in a deep breath. The air grew heavy, as though the walls and ceiling were pressing down. I knew this was the moment of compression before the break. They hadn't expected that one envelope could flip the board. If you've ever been placed in such a scene, you know silence itself is an answer, only it often sides with the powerful. And sometimes, just one sharp word or decisive act can change the entire outcome. Have you ever witnessed for the benefit being twisted into nothing but an excuse? If you have, share it in the comments because another story, spoken out loud, can sometimes save someone else. In my mind, one question kept circling: if they had prepared this thoroughly, then what else lay beyond that envelope? The room fell silent, so quiet I could hear the wind slipping through the crack in the door. And then, like a curtain about to fall, I knew the play wasn't over. The law required more than one envelope. And the truth always found its way back. We're moving out temporarily, I told Maya, keeping my voice as light as I could, as if this were just a short vacation. The new apartment wasn't big, but its windows looked out onto a row of birch trees, the wind slipping through the blinds like a quiet comfort. That night, Maya managed to sleep for 15 whole minutes, her breath slow and steady, no longer twitching like someone about to drown. Watching her curled under the blanket, I thought she looked like a person who had just surfaced from underwater, finally catching a breath of air after days of fear. A week later, while I was rearranging the kitchen shelf, the doorbell rang. The sound slammed into my chest, like an alarm siren. I cracked the door open, and my heart clenched. Victor, Margaret, and Clara stood there, holding paper bags, faces lit up like a rehearsed play. Their smiles weren't warm, they gleamed too brightly, the kind of reconciliation smile that everyone knows hides claws underneath. Maya stood still behind me, but I saw her hand tremble slightly. Without a word, she placed her phone on the small table near the door, opened the recording app, and let it run. An action that seemed simple, yet to us in that moment, it felt like a prayer. Chairs scraped, glasses clinked against the table, then Margaret's voice floated out, gentle but each word dropping heavy on the tiled floor. You're always far too sensitive. This life requires someone tougher. Do you really think you can do anything with that money? Victor followed, his tone low but sharp as a blade. If Uncle Paul were in his right mind, he would have chosen someone more grown up. Someone who could manage, not a child so easily swayed by feelings. Every sentence they spoke sounded to me like drops of water seeping into the cracks of the tiles. Sweetness laced with threat, dense and slippery, trying to pull Maya back into the old spiral. Maya looked at me. Her eyes carried both fear and defiance. Under the table, I squeezed her hand tightly, a silent message: let them talk. Let the recording bear witness. Clara suddenly cut in, her smile strained. We just want the family whole. Don't make this uglier than it already is. I remembered the female officer who had once visited our home, her hand resting on the brown envelope, her gaze silent yet full of warning. And now, it was they themselves who delivered more evidence, tightening the noose with their own hands. They didn't realize that their bail conditions forbade contact, yet here they were, letting their words fall straight into that tiny hard drive. The recording became the backbone of the case. No one needed to fabricate, no distorted retelling. That sound, real voices, from their own mouths, was enough to turn fear into evidence. I remember whispering to Maya after they left. They knocked with family, but demanded entry with a wallet. She nodded, eyes still glistening, but the corners of her lips trembled, as if for the first time she sensed the power of staying silent and letting truth speak for itself. That night, listening back to the recording, every word cut through the air like a knife, but at the same time each one became a brick laid into a protective wall. I sat beside Maya, watching the yellow light fall across her face, and thought, every minute we hold our boundaries is a minute we save ourselves. If you've ever had to draw boundaries with toxic family, you know that feeling, shaky yet freeing. It's never easy, but every time you say no, you're really saying yes to your own safety. Have you ever had to build a fence around your heart? Share it, because sometimes your story can help someone else realize they, too, have the right to shut the door. The next morning, the phone rang. Not Victor. Not Margaret. A strange number, but the voice was familiar, firm. The court is calling your names next week. I placed my hand on Maya's shoulder. She looked up, eyes caught between fear and a spark of hope. I knew the play outside was only just beginning, but at least this time, we had our own voice recorded, stored, undeniable. After the chaotic night with the recording, there was no way back. My lawyer, Mrs. Ellis, advised, this isn't just about protecting Maya. This is about ending the cycle of tyranny in the family. We filed the lawsuit, with me as the plaintiff representing my daughter. When the subpoenas were delivered, each person in that family revealed a different face. Victor slammed the stack of papers on the table, his face flushed with rage, roaring that we were disgracing the family. Margaret wrapped herself in her usual calm composure, but her hands gripped her purse straps so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Clara burst into tears right there on the porch, stammering as she called her friends for help. And then, just as the law dictated, they all had to sit in court, with no barriers left to hide behind. Plaintiff, please proceed. The judge's voice rang out. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor with a jarring screech, like teeth grinding. I stood, heart pounding, but Maya's hand brushed against my arm, a quiet strength. Caldwell, their attorney, still forced a smile, the kind of smile worn by someone convinced that procedure and power would protect him. Mrs. Ellis began. Her voice was clear, each word punctuated like a drumbeat. Your Honor, we present the evidence in chronological order. On the large screen appeared a photo of the latch fixed outside the basement door. Then a photo of the ceramic mug Maya had been forced to use exclusively, with lab results showing traces of sedatives. Next came the audio recording, Margaret's voice echoing through the courtroom, "You're always overly sensitive. If Uncle Paul were here, he'd choose someone more mature." The air in the room froze. Margaret closed her eyes, then opened them with a strained smile. Victor glared, chin raised defiantly. Clara sniffled, avoiding everyone's gaze. Caldwell clasped his hands behind his back, trying to suppress his unease with a stiff, balanced stance. The climax came when Ellis presented the email retrieved from Caldwell's computer. Subject line, worst-case scenario plan. The contents, a step-by-step outline for what to do if Maya resisted, ranging from increasing the dosage in her tea to suggesting restorative treatment at a private facility. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. I glanced at Maya. She bit her lip, but for the first time lifted her head high, staring straight ahead. Caldwell struck back. He strode forward, voice booming, "Your Honor, this was no conspiracy. This was a family acting out of concern, acting for the well-being of a fragile member. Those emails? Hypothetical notes. Nothing proves they were ever put into action. The judge frowned. Ellis rose calmly. Then how do you explain the latch outside the basement door? The toxicology results? The recorded violation of the restraining order? Caldwell hesitated, then forced a smirk, trying to dismiss it all as a misunderstanding. When it came to cross-examination, the cracks in their unity split wide open. Clara trembled, pointing at her mother. You told me to keep quiet. You said this was just light treatment. I didn't think it was. Margaret cut her off. Don't you dare put this all on me. Caldwell drafted the paperwork. Caldwell chuckled bitterly, raising his chin. I only followed Victor's instructions. And Victor bellowed, I just wanted to keep the estate from falling into the hands of a child who knows nothing. No one else needed to condemn them. They turned the courtroom into a stage of mutual accusations all on their own. I turned to Maya. Her eyes glistened. And when Ellis asked, would you like to speak before the court? Maya rose. She didn't tremble, didn't avert her gaze. Her voice rang out, I don't need them to believe me. I just need the truth to be written into the record. In that moment, the room went silent. No one argued further. Even the judge looked at her longer than necessary, as if acknowledging the weight of her words from such a young woman. Then the gavel struck. The room reverberated with its sharp crack. For the first time, that sound made me feel that the very house that had once imprisoned us, finally echoed with the right sound, the sound of truth. Defendants, rise. The judge's voice echoed in the courtroom like the opening strike of a fateful symphony. The verdict was read, each sentence falling like drumbeats with no excess, no lack. Victor 6 years in prison. Margaret 4 years. Clara 18 months. And Caldwell 8 years, along with the revocation of his license to practice law. No one looked at one another. No whisper, no hidden squeeze of hands behind the bench. Only a heavy silence draping over everything. I scanned each face. Victor stared blankly into space, his jaw twitching as if trying to swallow down something lodged tight. Margaret kept forcing a calm smile, but her eyes trembled like thin paint about to peel. Clara bowed her head, her hair falling to cover the pallor of her skin. Caldwell adjusted his tie slightly, as if that small strip of fabric could mask the collapse of an entire lifetime of reputation. And me. I looked only at Maya. She sat beside me, her body tilting gently, like a leaf after a strong wind, searching again for a steady breath. And right on her chest, the wooden owl pendant glimmered. I knew Maya had been gripping it tightly through the whole trial, as if it were a thread tying her back to both the bright and the dark memories. Now, light from the window spilled across it, bouncing into her eyes. Her chest rose and fell, but no longer in panic. It felt like, at last, a true wind had found her. I realized, justice, when it comes, isn't thunder crashing. It's cool air rushing into a sealed room late, but still enough to keep someone alive. Margaret turned her head toward me, her eyes weary. She started to speak, then froze. Victor strained, trying to choke back a howl, and failed. Clara gave a small sob, like someone suddenly recognizing the wall firmly shut in front of her. Caldwell let out a laugh, but it was bitter, stripped of sharpness. I inhaled deeply. In that moment, I saw clearly, justice cannot erase what has already happened, cannot wash away the wounds rooted deep in memory. But it can be a new lock, sealing shut the door they had walked through for years as if it were their own house, trampling our safety. And once that door closed, another path, narrow, uneven, began to open. Maya leaned in and whispered, "Mom, we're done, aren't we?" I only nodded, my hand finding hers, squeezing tight. In that instant, I understood that today's verdict wasn't just for them. It was proof that we had the right to step outside, no longer confined in the house of control and tyranny. The whole courtroom rose as the final gavel struck. But inside me, there was no deafening echo. Only silence. Only release. If this story touches you somewhere, don't hesitate to speak up. Because sometimes, just by sharing, someone out there may see a thread, fragile as it is, that's enough to pull them out of the dark. I looked at Maya. Her face, still streaked with the marks of tears, now shone as if the last thick layer of dust had finally been wiped away. And I told myself, justice may not give back the lost time, but it can create a new space wide enough for a future to breathe. Justice doesn't erase the past, I whispered, the words etched straight into my heart, but it locks the door people once walked through as if it were theirs. And now, what remains is learning how to live in a new house, not one built of bricks and stone, but of peace and chosen freedom. A house within ourselves. Dawn in the new apartment carries no trace of mold. The early light slips through the white curtains, soft as silk, laying itself across the warm wooden floor. Maya pours peppermint tea into a brand new green mug, the very first thing we bought for this kitchen. She lifts it to her lips, steam circling her face, and I realize her breathing no longer trembles. We've built a small habit, locking the door 3 times before going to bed. Not because fear still clings to us, but because we want to carve it into memory that safety can be rebuilt. The lock clicks tack 3 times, and every time Maya lets out a quiet laugh, like a secret code only the two of us share. One morning, I opened my inbox and found a message from Mr. Andrew, her old literature teacher. "The girl has turned in her unfinished poem," he wrote, short but warm. I sat still for a moment, then opened the attachment. The trembling lines of yesterday now continued in steadier handwriting. Maya sat beside me, watching me read, her eyes bright as if the entire world had just been rewritten onto that page. Mrs. Nora stopped by too. She brought a still warm apple pie, setting it on the table like a simple ritual. I remember she was once the neighbor who stood at her window, watching silently, witnessing those old rainy nights we never dared to speak of. Today, as she placed the pie down, she gave a small smile. I didn't stand at the window to watch other people's lives, but to remind myself I could still bear witness to what is right. Her words filled the little kitchen with another layer of breath and warmth. I remember one morning, right after locking the door, Maya turned back and held up the keys. Her voice playful but true, safety isn't about the number of locks, it's about no one else having the key. That sentence echoed in me, like a brand new definition of freedom. The mornings here no longer smell of old rain. We wake to birdsong, to the scent of leftover apple pie, to the quiet certainty that we have the right to choose how our day begins. Every small movement feels like a reminder, we stepped out, and now we are stepping forward. But just as life began to find its rhythm, something very real came knocking. A thick envelope was slid under the door, sealed with deep red wax, inheritance papers. The new door had only just opened, yet the shadow of the old one seemed to hover nearby. And I knew this journey still had a stretch of road left unnamed. "It belongs to you," the new lawyer said, pushing the file toward Maya. The paper with the red seal felt like another door being opened, but this time no one was forcing her to step inside. I watched Maya's hand as she placed it on the stack, trembling at first, then slowly tightening its grip. Inside was enough money for school, for therapy, and for the trips she could choose herself, with no one holding the reins. I didn't cry. I just took a deep breath, like someone suddenly remembering that lungs were made to fill with air, not to hold silence. Each breath carried away a layer of dust from those long years of neglect, falling off, weightless. That night, Maya pulled out a pencil and set a blank sheet before her. She didn't write, didn't draw a flower or some distant memory. She began sketching Uncle Paul's wooden owl. Each stroke fell like the hand of a clock, every line reclaiming moments that had been stolen. I stood behind her, watching her back quiver under the light, and this time, I reached out and placed my hand on her shoulder. That hand, after all those years, finally stopped shaking. We didn't say much. Only the sound of the pencil moving, as if time itself were piecing the fragments back together. On the page, the owl's eyes slowly lit up, a silent witness to a girl rewriting the history of her own life. I remembered the words she once said at the front door, key in hand, "Safety isn't about how many locks you have, it's about no one else having the key." And now, she was proving it in another way. That inheritance, those documents were not shackles, but an affirmation that she had the right to define freedom for herself. The message crystallized in me was clear: family does not equal safety, love is not found in titles, but in choices and actions, and sometimes, a single phone call at the right time can alter a destiny. If this story touched you, especially if you've lived among people who called themselves kind in ways that only made you smaller, leave a few words. Maybe, your words will be someone's call 911 note out there. A short comment, sometimes, is the life raft someone clings to. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through journeys of healing and breaking free from these invisible walls, press like so the story doesn't get lost, subscribe so you won't miss the next journey, and if you feel moved, share it because someone might stumble across it just when they need it most. Those small actions can be the threads that tie us together in a world where too many walk in silence. That night, when Maya put down the pencil, the sketch of the wooden owl was complete. I saw her smile, and I realized, forgiveness is not a gift we give because someone deserves it, but a piece of baggage we set down so the road ahead will be lighter. The screen may soon go dark, but if this last line stays with you, I'm content. I don't forgive because they deserve it, I forgive because the road ahead needs to be lighter.